Thank you very much, Jacques, for this very kind introduction. Thank you, Petre, for welcoming us. And it's always a pleasure, of course, to have this seminar with our Czech colleagues. I hope that we can have the same in Paris next year. So we have to find another crisis to attract people. The first panel is about the consequences of the conflict for the EU neighbourhood policy, and we have three speakers. Let me introduce the speakers. The first is Lucia Najšlová, who is a research fellow at the Faculty of Social Sciences, what we call in Prague FSV, at Charles University. Then we will have Jacques Rupnik, who is a senior research fellow at CERI, and Michal Šimečka, who is at the Institute of International Relations, a research fellow, so in the Institute of Neighbourhood. So what I suggest is that we have time for the discussion, so your preliminary statement should be 10-15 minutes. Is it okay? And then we will open the debate. So, Lucia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian. It's my honor to be sitting in such a privileged panel in such an important conference. I will try to be brief, and as Petra asked me, to be slightly provocative, since it's early morning and not everybody has finished their coffee yet. So, if you look at the title of the panel, Consequences of the Conflict for the EU Neighbourhood Policy, my first question was, are we talking about what are the consequences or what should be the consequences? Because if we talk about what are the consequences, then of course we have seen these business versus human rights debate. Do we care more about our short-term specific trade interests, or do we actually care about the human rights of Ukrainians and also our rights in the long term? Now, among this debate, we have occasionally adopted a few rounds of sanctions, we had adopted a few statements and aid packages. Now, I believe that the debate about what should happen should be much broader. And the crisis that we are seeing in the Eastern neighborhood is a consequence of resignation on politics, is a consequence of cynicism, apathy, and lack of faith that things can be actually changed by politics. I might not be very original when I'm stating this, but I do believe that these are the underlying reasons of the problems we are seeing. So, to talk about new approach to neighborhoods, and I'm very grateful to Jacques Rupnik for mentioning that we have two neighborhoods and we have to perceive them in relation to each other, which is not a very common thing in Central Europe. In Central Europe, we usually think about ourselves and occasionally about the East. But we also need to rethink the underlying pillars of European integration, because in the end, we cannot offer Ukraine or any Eastern partners or any other partners anything better than we already have at home. And as you see at home, things are not working in exactly very good way. We have trouble with what our internal market has been delivering. If you follow the Greek versus German or German versus the Greek debate on European economy, you sometimes get the impression that Europeans are not one political community. We are very far from it, actually. At the same time, we see growing xenophobia, anti-immigrant rhetoric, and lacking policies to address this. And especially in the past weeks, it has been very embarrassing to be sitting in front of TV screens in Central Europe and listening to what everything our leaders are able to say about migrants and refugees from the Mediterranean. These are the things that have to be kept in mind when talking about policy instruments or the European neighbourhood policy. Now, there have been two streams of debate about the Ukraine crisis. One would talk about security aspects, such as, and this I would say was a stream that got most attention. Yeah? Here we talked about threat to territorial integrity and instigation of violence. And these are, of course, things that have to be addressed. But the current crisis is not just about this type of security. And also, if you take the example of the EU's southern neighborhood, This was a region which has been extremely securitized in our foreign policy, and this approach did not bring us far. It didn't make us more secure, and it did not allow us to, or did not create opportunity for solving the essential problems that have to be solved. So let me bring attention to the second stream, the one that didn't receive as much attention, but it is very important. And those are the socio-economic and political aspects of the European project, whether EU at home or EU's policy towards its partners. This has to be a crucial part of the debate, and I would like to emphasize politics, because healthy politics, only healthy politics can be a basis of responsible policy. And in talking about European neighbourhood policy, we often reduce ourselves to discussing specific policy instruments, and we forget the larger political picture. So if I just touch upon some of the issues that have already been raised by Jacques Rupnik in his opening remarks, the economic crisis. The economic crisis is, however, not just about the GDP and growth. It is also precarious working environment. It is also about the changing nature of work. If you look at the public opinion polls, or generally at the demands and expectations of EU's eastern or southern neighbors, the economy, jobs, work, dignified working environment. These are one of the crucial things that are expected from life, but also from the EU. Now, going back to the European Union, the crisis goes hand in hand with erosion of institutions that are essential for functioning of democracy. All around Europe, in the EU, but also in the neighborhoods, we have seen a wave of protests. For example, student protests around Europe. Whether we are talking about Macedonia or about Poland, protests against neoliberal approach to university education that has actually not going to deliver positive outcomes for democratic society. At the same time, income inequality in general. There has been quite a substantial global debate about how underinvestment into public institutions and ignorance of certain socio-economic basic rights is ruining the political rights. Unfortunately, in Central Europe, very often these things come as too radical or redundant. And finally, climate challenge or climate action. We are unlikely to address these issues with some of our existing paradigms. But now, if you look at the discourse that the Ukraine crisis or war in Ukraine has generated, it would be more pushed towards fossil fuel security. And unfortunately, the Ukraine crisis did not exactly bring us into more debate about how to downsize our dependence on fossils. Now, we could continue with a number of broader challenges, but I would like to at this point emphasize that these are the trends from which the discussion about ENP policy instruments have often been detached. We have often studied the ENP as a set of policy instruments, grant-making bodies and agencies. And while a number of the agencies and bodies that we have in place at the moment are doing great and useful work, we might not be able to reach the outcome we desire, if I stay on the idealistic note and ambitious note, if we do not talk more politics. Now, two crucial points. One of the things that Ukraine crisis has revealed is that it has been short-sighted to leave the relations with the East largely to a technical process led by the Commission. Yeah? The talks with our Eastern neighbors have not found sufficient political backing of our EU leaders at home. And this is also a consequence of another broader trend in Western diplomacy, not just Western, and that's economization of diplomacy. The perception that diplomacy is here to open the gate for business. Yeah, these are two, interrelated trends. Now, secondly, the debate about the future of the neighborhood policy, I believe, has to be more informed by the debate about the future of the EU itself. How do we see the democracy? How do we see the quality of our institutions? What pathways do we have for not just rights written somewhere in the treaties in the legal country, but to access to rights, to the rights being implemented in the real country, or as John Drizek says, rights, the free speech that actually matters. Now, let me close by a few remarks about how all this has been translated into Czech policy in the past years. In the past 1 year, the Czech foreign policy, especially the one towards the east, has been under spotlight. Lots of articles has been published on this. The debate has generated many emotions. Now, as number of you, or I would say most of this audience, is probably familiar with the fact that last year we have changed the government, and the new government brought new impulse into foreign policy making, started actually bringing some of the trends common in Western Europe into mainstream debate in the Czech Republic. Now, unfortunately, at certain points, the discussion about new foreign policy has turned into a competition about who loves Václav Havel more. And some of the issues that were presented that should be mainstreamed into policymaking, such as socio-economic dimensions, environmental dimensions. Yes, they have been brought to the debate, they have been legitimized, but we have not reached the stage of policy implementation. We did not get to the point that these newly formed priorities, which are quite bold and courageous, would make it into, practical policy framework of relations with, for example, the country which is crucial for the Eastern neighborhood, and that is Ukraine. If you just look at the debate about the DCFTA, then this has been limited to talking about benefits and losses for our businesses, and the impacts on Ukraine actually were not very much present in the debate. And this is a consequence of more factors, of course. On the one hand, there is this belief in national sovereignty, or this is how it is often framed, that it is up to the Ukrainians to check whether and what type of agreement with the EU is advantageous for them. Secondly, what I already mentioned is the economization of diplomacy, diminishing will to understand diplomacy also as something that creates political relations, not just business exchange. At the same time, we've been hearing statements such as we have to focus largely on Azerbaijan because this is the most important trade and strategic partner. As I'm sure you understand, this is a very narrow understanding of strategic interest. At the same time, we have seen in the Czech debate very interesting interplay of the West as a model and inspire, when a number of Czech politicians have been suggesting that why shouldn't we give a priority to business interests if the French are doing it as well? Yeah? For example, François Hollande's lobbying for Alstom in Baku, etc. This is one of business versus human rights has been an essential dilemma under every government that the Czech Republic has had, and looking into prioritization of what we are going to do in the East. Very often the Czech leaders take good but also bad examples from their Western counterparts. Now, talking specifically about Ukraine, in late 2003, when the crisis erupted, it seemed that large part of the elite was surprised, and we have learned that in fact until late 2013 the Eastern dimension of foreign policy has been really a matter of interest of a small handful of diplomats and activists, but not really a subject of broad political debate. The political parties didn't prioritize the neighborhood policy in their political programs, and this is a country that very often says that East is our priority. So you can only imagine how little priority is the South. Yeah, unfortunately. Also, if you look at some numbers. When the Georgian crisis broke out in 2008, the government committed 3 times more resources in the immediate help than when the Ukrainian crisis broke out. And Ukraine is about 8 times bigger than Georgia, if we want to talk about impacts of the assistance. Now, I'm finishing. I should be, right?
Yeah. It's fine.
Now, it is widely known, and I believe that a number of my colleagues will talk about it, that the Czech government, just like any government in the EU, was split on how to approach the crisis, and the government was also criticized by the opposition by not doing enough. But let me highlight one statement of an opposition leader, the head of ODS, Mr. Fiala, that illustrates some of the cynicism I'm talking about. Ukraine, which I know very well, is not any model democracy, and for myself I say that ideas, for example, to admit it faster into the EU or NATO are absolutely nonsense. For me, and this should be the case also for the others, it is not important what is happening inside Russia and inside Ukraine. Russia is not advancing against Ukraine, but against international order, of which we are part of, and which is threatening interests of Western democracies. To give you another example of cynical and resigned approach to discussing the politics of our relations with the East, it was the debate about Volhynia Czechs, which is a minority with Czech roots living in Ukraine. Now, this debate about repatriation of a couple of people was started strictly for domestic political purposes, and the cynical aspect of the fact is that this is in a situation where large amounts of Ukrainians have been internally displaced, where there is a demand for more assistance, where there is a demand for much more responsible politics. And the Czech politicians were preoccupying themselves about how to spin the Volhynia Czech tragedy. We can get to it later. I think this is very interesting. A final example is that the Ukrainians, who happen to be the biggest foreign-born or the biggest minority in the Czech Republic, and one which is known for doing a lot of work in construction, cleaning, etc., etc. If the Czechs are asked how would they grade Ukrainians, whether they are nice people or not so nice people, on 1 to 5, 1 very nice, 5 not very nice, Ukrainians are receiving about 3.5 on the scorecard, report card. Now, if you compare this again with the very disturbing debate we had about migration from the south, there is such a long to-do list that we have to finish at home in the Czech Republic, and I'm sure that also in France and in other countries. And without finishing this to-do list, we are unlikely to reach a more responsible policy towards our Eastern partners. So I'll cut it here. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the debate.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lucia. You stressed a lot of interesting elements for the discussion. One was about the problem of values and interests in the definition of a foreign policy. You said that in Czech Republic there is a debate on how to accommodate human rights and economic interests, but I think this is a debate we have in most of the democracies about the foreign policy we have to adopt vis-à-vis, in particular vis-à-vis Putin's Russia. So it's a pleasure for me now to introduce Jacques Rupnik. Before I give the floor to Jacques, I would like to do some publicity. This is it's like at the TV, you know, this is a page of publicity, and this is Jacques' last book called in French Géopolitique de la démocratisation, so geopolitics of democratization, Europe and its neighborhood. So it's directed by Jacques Rupnik, and Jacques is open to a translation in any language. So if somebody would like to translate it, of course in Czech, but also in other languages, Jacques is open to negotiations. You can see him at the break. So Jacques, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Christian. This was beyond anything I could have hoped. I think translation in Russian would be a priority, I think, given our subject. The others can wait. First, two words about the context in which we are addressing the issue. First observation, exactly a year ago, 25th of May, you have European elections taking place in all our countries, member states, which produce an upsurge, a rise of parties with anti-European agendas. So you have a crisis of self-doubt within the EU. On the same date, you have an election in Kiev where you can put it in inverted commas, you know, the pro-European candidate, the man who's supposed to bring Ukraine closer to Europe, is elected. So there you have it, you know, demand for Europe in Ukraine and self-doubt on the same day displayed within Europe. That is the dilemma, that is a context within which we are addressing the issue. The second observation concerning how the crisis, the recent crisis, has affected the ENP, the neighbourhood policy, which is our topic, is that if we compare to the period when this policy was conceived in 2003, 2004, you could say in a nutshell, Europe has changed, Russia has changed, the neighbourhoods have changed. Europe has changed. In a nutshell, this is what I was alluding to. We had a self-confident moment with the EU enlargement of 2004. We have a moment of self-doubt 10 years after. Russia has changed. Well, Marie will talk about that better than I could, but everybody can see that since, I would date it since the Orange Revolution of 2004, so it has to do with Ukraine, of course. The domestic authoritarian twist has taken place, and a new, much more assertive policy in the neighborhood on the periphery of the former Soviet Union, and of course with the implications for relations with the West. And the neighborhood has changed. And you know, the initial document that Solana and Patton had devised in 2003 was called Wider Europe. Well, this is Wilder Europe. So, you know, the further east you move, the more difficult it is to promote the kind of policy that was envisaged at the time. This is the context within which we are addressing the issue, and I will only briefly discuss the 3 Ds that I had decided to put as headlines: differentiation, division, deconstruction. So let me start with the first one, differentiation. I can move very quickly, but clearly the whole neighborhood policy compared to the initial outline, remember initial outline, circle of friends around Europe, everything but institutions. Anyway, we can come back to what the initial concept was. The main criticism that came in, especially from countries of Eastern Europe, you need to differentiate. And in fact, the first who wanted differentiation was Russia, because they said they were initially in the Patton-Solana concept, they were in the neighborhood concept. And I said, wow, we are not simply, you know, neighborhood country like Moldova or Azerbaijan, you know, we are special, etc. And so we need a special relationship, special partnership was designed. So that was the first call for differentiation. Then you had the second call, 2008, when the Sikorsky-Carl Bildt paper proposal to differentiate East and South. This is when Union for Mediterranean was proposed on one hand and Eastern Partnership on the other. Almost simultaneously, the two things were proposed. So you have there first differentiation, and the argument was these countries of the post-Soviet area are specific case and they need a coherent single policy for that area. Well, what we discover if we take it today at the Riga summit, well, the motto of the day was differentiation, differentiation and flexibility. and differentiation, because each country is in a different situation, therefore it deserves different kind of neighborhood policy. And yes, we have to address the Ukrainian crisis, which is a kind of emergency, but then we have Moldova and Georgia, the two countries with which we can develop. We just lifted the visa facility restrictions on Moldova, and then you have different countries such as Armenia and Belarus, which have a relationship with the different relationship with Russia, etc., etc. So differentiation and flexibility. So if you take it back to 2003, different phases of differentiation have been imposed, sometimes by external actors as Russia, sometimes by simply the different trajectories of the partners. Divisions. This concerns about the way the Ukrainian crisis has highlighted some of the dividing lines within the EU itself, in the responses, in the perceptions, in the policies that different countries thought fit, and I'm sure in the following panel we will return to that. But I simply wanted to stress that if you want to understand that, you have to bear in mind that, as I said, that there are the two neighborhoods, Eastern and Southern, and that you have Europe divided East and South, not just on neighborhood policy, but within the EU. Sure. The East-South divide, East-West divide, has been to a large degree overcome or reduced or constrained over the last 20 years. Look at economic figures. Basically, it's a story of convergence. With the economic and financial crisis of 2008 comes to the fore the North-South divide. Within the EU, within the very core of the EU, within the Eurozone. And therefore, when you're discussing policies towards Eastern and Southern neighborhood, you have to take into account the East-West and North-South within the EU itself. And we can come back, I don't have time to spell it in great detail, but that, of course, affects, as I said, both the perceptions, the priorities, the policies that different countries advocate. Now, that has been often led to oversimplifications. Interestingly, the European neighborhood policy has been blown apart by the neighborhoods themselves, by the crisis in the neighborhoods, both in the Ukraine and in the rise of ISIS on the southern flank. So you had a policy, it's blown apart by simply the crisis on the outside. What you had, however, at least as far as the Ukrainian crisis, and this was not an obvious thing at the beginning, Europeans adopted sanctions. They found a way not to have a neighborhood policy, but at least a response to crisis management. They agreed on sanctions, stage 1, remember, stage 2, stage 3, now they're still discussed, and mediation either between Russia and Ukraine on, say, energy. It was at the EU summit in Milan that the energy deal between Ukraine and Russia was negotiated with EU financial backing in it. So either as mediator, or as we have seen, the Weimar formula, France, Germany, Poland, which was in effect at the beginning of the Ukrainian crisis, has shifted to the Normandy format in the negotiation Minsk I, Minsk II. And interestingly, the question would be, what would Europeans do if Minsk II fails? That would be an interesting question for our discussion, but I don't want to preempt that. So we had this dual thing, sanctions, mediation. This is at least, let's say, the minimal program that the Europeans have achieved, but that doesn't make indeed a European neighborhood policy. Second caveat, the assumption that countries of East Central Europe are some kind of bloc that was interested in the Eastern Partnership. Remember, it was launched in Prague in the spring of 2009. That they are a kind of group that pushes. No, there's Poland and the Balts. And then you have a big difference. And they are not only for very firm policy vis-à-vis Russia, they are for strong support of the Ukrainian government today, financial, etc., and also for giving a European perspective to democratizing Ukraine. Okay? But you have at the opposite side, you have Orban and Orban's Hungary, which not only welcomed Putin in Budapest, that was the first visit in Budapest, and struck a deal on nuclear energy, and you know the Orban statements on the Ukrainian crisis, that there is not much to choose between democracy in the Ukraine and in Russia. And the Czechs and the Slovaks are somewhere in the between. We can return to that in the discussion. But clearly you have, yes, you have north-south divisions, but there is no east within the EU. And in the south, perhaps I should make a special mention of Greece and Cyprus. They are the most committed pro-Russian elements within the EU, and that makes, of course, any policy adventures much more difficult. I move quickly to my third point because that is the deconstruction of the ENP. I said deconstruction is a polite word for simply implosion. You have a policy that was derived from the successful enlargement policy. And, it was called the 3M, money, markets, mobility. Well, we open our markets, you adopt our norms of governance, etc. This is how we democratize our neighborhoods. Secondly, mobility. We give visa facilitation, people move around, they adopt socialization, they move around, they adopt European patterns. And financial aid, we help you to restructure, to do structural reforms. Well, all this was, as I say, derived from the successful neighborhood policy, enlargement policy, with the main difference it didn't have enlargement prospect. But the main question is, of course, what happens when soft power, or so-called normative power of the European Union, encounters geopolitics, encounters raw force, as it was used in Ukraine, as it was used in the annexation of Crimea, etc. So you have a fair weather concept of enlargement, of neighborhood policy derived from the enlargement policy. But when confronted with the logic of power and with geopolitics, well, then you have a new debate. Not only rethink about ENP, the neighborhood policy, no longer in existence, rest in peace, but urgent discussion within the EU about the hierarchy of priorities. Because most people, everybody in the EU would agree that you have the question of democratization on the periphery and the neighborhoods. That was a debate about the Arab Spring. It was a debate about how to help say Ukraine after Maidan, etc. You have the issue of democratization. You have the question of security, which I don't have to dwell on, which is a major issue. You have the question of energy in the eastern neighborhood. This is how, through Ukraine, that most of the gas comes from, and the dependency, particularly in this part of the world, is very important. And then you have the question of migration, number 4. And most people would agree on the list. The question is how you articulate the list. What is the hierarchy of priorities among the list? Right now, if I had to do the sums, I would say security, migration is number 1, energy, and then democratization comes last. So as my time is running out, I would simply conclude with this. We've had a European concept based on a peace project through interdependence, the so-called soft power, the transformative power, which worked remarkably in East Central Europe. And that peace project works within the EU. And it is a success, a remarkable success story. I'm not knocking it down. I'm simply saying our neighborhoods, both east and south, and perhaps in the eyes of French leaders today, probably the south is a more urgent security question. But the geopolitical challenge, the challenge of force, puts a new question. The question is not just what's your ENP, the question is what's your common foreign and security policy, what's your defense policy? Is there a European defense? So you have new question. Final word, we thought in the neighborhood policy, the key issue was the center shapes the peripheries. The center diffuses its norms, its institutions, its practices, through its economic influence, through the tools, through the toolkit that I have mentioned. And now we have perhaps a different situation when it is the changes on the periphery, the challenges they pose, that are possibly redefining the European agenda and the European way of thinking about not just the neighborhood, but about itself.
Thank you very much, Jacques, for this very interesting statement. And I think the question you ask at the end is a more general question about what kind of power the EU can be, which is very much stressed by the experience of the European neighbourhood policy. And as you said, this conflict between a normative approach, what we call normative power in the literature, and a very classic geopolitical approach coming from current Russia. So thank you. Now I'm pleased to give the floor to Michal Šimečka. No book to promote, Michal? No? No? Okay. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And let me say that it's obviously a pleasure to be part of such a panel. Now, my presentation is based on a joint research project with a colleague of mine, Ben Talis, who's sitting over there. It's still very much a work in progress, but essentially we're trying to think through the implications of the Ukraine conflict for the Eastern Partnership Program in particular, or well, the corpse that remains of it after Jacques is pronounced dead. But asking the question, so what impact have the events of the past year on Ukraine had on the EAP? Well, the short answer would be that in practice not much of an impact at all. I mean, the EMP itself is not undergoing any policy or institutional change as a result of the conflict. It would probably not look very different today had Viktor Yanukovych signed the DCFTA in Vilnius. Probably the majority of the paragraphs of the Riga summit conclusions would read the same today and similarly disappointing today. But the longer answer would be that the conflict is contributing to fundamental changes in the sort of construction and the identity of the EAP, because it reinforces and accelerates some of the tendencies in the EU's approach that has been already present before the conflict and before Vilnius. And we, well, me and Ventalis argue or think that these are very problematic and they're causing the Eastern Partnership to drift from so-called constructive ambiguity. I know this is a very loaded term and very well known in France in particular. We use it in a positive sense. But these tendencies are causing the EAP to drift from constructive to deconstructive ambiguity and possibly toward what we call destructive certainty. But before unpacking the argument, let me just briefly summarize what we see as the likely direction of the EAP based on the various Commission documents surrounding the ENP review and obviously lots of commentaries that have been out by relevant think tanks. Now, there are we identify five interlinked kind of elements of the EU's adjustment to the new security situation. Some of these have already been mentioned. Obviously, the first one is a much sharper focus on defining the interests, the EU's interests and the partners' interests as a basis for political dialogue, sectoral cooperation, assistance. This is becoming increasingly juxtaposed against the generic shared values concept as a source of policy direction. This turn to interest is particularly pronounced in the joint consultation paper of the Commission of March 2015 on the ENP review. The second element of adjustment, again has been mentioned, is further differentiation between Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova on the one hand, obviously, and Azerbaijan, Armenia, Belarus on the other, which leads to kind of a two-tier Eastern Partnership, where, in fact, you can say that the EU has an association policy which is anchored in the implementation of the comprehensive and penetrating DCFTAs for one group, and a residual neighborhood policy which is more flexible and focused on a limited number of interests or shared interests, mobility, security, energy, and based on variable contractual relations with the three countries. Third element of this adjustment is that the EU wants to reinvent itself as, or the Eastern Partnership, as a much more political, and this again has been mentioned by Lucia, as a much more political player in the neighborhood. Obviously, this sort of call for greater politicization is to some extent an answer to long-standing criticism that has been mentioned here, that the EAPs is over-bureaucratized and divorced from reality, where in many of these countries it's the informal elite networks rather than formal institutions and rules that actually matter, and the EU is unable to cope with that. So that's the third element. The fourth would be, again, already mentioned, a stronger emphasis on security, or enhancing the geopolitical strategic profile, security profile of the EAP. So there will be lots of emphasis on security cooperation with partners, efforts to link the partnership program more organically to CSDP and CSFP. So what we could expect in future EAP would be more of a classical foreign policy and less external governance, in the sense of kind of extending EU's ways and means beyond its existing borders in a mechanical way as in enlargement. And finally, the fifth element of adjustment, again not very new, but getting more and more attention these days again, in Riga as well, is kind of the prioritization of the bilateral aspect of the bilateral relationships at the expense of the multilateral track, along with kind of a stronger appreciation of the actorness of our partners, which is expressed through the narrative of their sovereign choice, of also developmental narratives such as joint ownership, mutual accountability. All of this is to highlight kind of the ostensible symmetry of their partnership with the EU. Now, each of these adjustments, each of these changes are very sensible in their own right and perfectly rational as a response, but we argue that taken together, they actually constitute a significant shift in the spirit of the EAP. And that's by the very act of over-defining the policy, of injecting more clarity and removing some of the ambiguity and open-endedness or potentiality of the original ENP and EAP construction. Because, I mean, obviously, ambiguity has been central to the neighbourhood policy. It's fraught with tensions, contradictions, paradoxes at various levels, and we all know that. But still, we would say that in the early stages of the ENP and later the EAP, there was, given the impossibility of further enlargement, there was a way in which the EU succeeded in managing these ambiguities constructively, in a way that various tensions, contradictions actually operated in a symbiotic and mutually reinforcing relationship. For instance, I mean, the ontological, the main ambiguity concerns, I mean, the identity of us and them. Who are the neighbors? Obviously, that's embodying the very concept of neighborhood. But since originally there was the promise and possibility of performative change from the essentialist Eastern outsiders to insiders through meeting the various EU's benchmark criteria, there was still a way to manage this tension. Similarly, when it comes to the values interests nexus, again discussed here, the initial framing in the wider Europe document that Jacques Rupnik mentioned was, again, an attempt to reconcile this trade-off, so to speak, or this dichotomy of interest versus values, because the argument was that building a zone of democracy, prosperity, good governance would actually safeguard regional security, EU security, and minimize the risk of various threats. Then obviously there's the dichotomy of the EAP as the technocratic and the political. And again, I mean, for some time, it was able, the Eastern Partnership was able to present itself both as kind of a postmodern, commission-run bureaucratic exercise, as well as a strategic endeavor to transform the politics of Eastern Neighbourhood for those who wish to see it that way. So that's kind of, again, how this ambiguity was sort of constructed in some sense. And also, when it comes to the bilateral versus regional dichotomy, the original setup actually encouraged the pursuit of both of these tracks, simply by bundling these disparate countries together under the same framework, and therefore, binding them by this shared set of values and asymmetrical asymmetry and asymmetrical relations with the EU. And finally, and most importantly, the EU was sort of successful in mitigating the most glaring of these tensions, that is between the imperfect reality of the Eastern Partnership, of ENP, compared to the ideal of enlargement. Obviously, because we all know that ENP is very similar institutionally to enlargement, but very different politically. But it was precisely because it was open-ended, undefined, the Eastern Partnership in the initial stages. There was this potentiality of what it could become that allowed the Eastern partners, for some time, to kind of give it the benefit of the doubt, to treat it as a transitory stage, as a potential stepping stone to enlargement, in which they could imagine it being, just one revolution away. And all of this taken together has really delivered in terms of some or modicum of reforms. It helped mobilize popular support for the EU and sustained, most importantly, sustained engagement. At the same time as helping EU member states to buy into the policy and Russia to accept it as a mere bureaucratic exercise until 2013, of course. But what we're claiming is that today, these very same tensions, ambiguities are actually becoming deconstructed, are actually starting to work against each other. So today, the EU is forced to choose between values and interests. Not only in the Ukraine conflict, but also in areas such as mobility, of course, where on the one hand you have the imperative of free movement that promotes socialization, prosperity, but it clashes with concerns of security. And the logic of differentiation that Jacques actually spoke about reflects this disconnect between values and interests, because it dilutes the integrity, universality of shared values, and implies that there's more for more values for Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and more for more interests for Azerbaijan, Belarus, and Armenia. And well, next, there's again the dichotomy between the technocratic and the political faces of the Eastern Partnership. That is now have become thoroughly damaging, because Russia interprets the Eastern Partnership as too much of a geopolitical power grab, which is a perception that contributed to the conflict, whereas Kiev and other governments fret that it is not strategic enough. So, and I think going forward, the demands of geopolitics will further undermine the sort of technocratic logic of conditionality. And it's the same with the other tension that is between the bilateral and multilateral dimensions. They are no longer seen as mutually compatible or mutually reinforcing. The EU's clear preference for bilateralism essentially means that any ambitions, if they're ever wearing, for the EAP to become some sort of an inclusive region-building project, perhaps a vehicle for including key other actors like Turkey, potentially Russia, or a foundation of some sort of a multilateral regional order underwritten by the EU, these are all now abandoned because we've chosen to prioritize the bilateral track. Most importantly, however, as the Eastern Partnership is taking on more and more characteristics of a foreign policy, the language of tending to mutual interest, symmetrical bilateral relationship, a stronger CSDP dimension, it is progressively decoupling from the enlargement model, becoming less and less similar to the enlargement model. And this divergence is causing much frustration among the countries in the region, because they feel trapped in kind of the straitjacket of the EAP, which, instead of being a transitory stepping stone, it's now revealing itself to be a permanent stumbling block, and kind of perpetuating this vicious circle where their inability to meet the various EU standards reinforces their identity as the other, and vice versa. Their essentialist Eastness seemingly kind of explains their ineptitude and corruption, and that's going on. So what we would say in conclusion is that so long as the Eastern Partnership remained vague and open-ended, its various ambiguities and tensions were constructive, because everyone, the EU member states, Russia, but also the Eastern partners, could project their own imagined futures onto it. But today, as the EU moves to define the Eastern Partnership, its identity more clearly, by closing some of the paths that have not been taken or that could be taken, we risk losing that vital spirit of hope of what it could become. And again, let me stress that even if some of the proposals, such as differentiations, are, they make perfect sense, but if you look at it from the perspective of Kiev, the uncertainty and vagueness of the original ENP and EAP is actually preferable to the certainty of being included in the association DCFTA grouping, especially after what the Ukrainians have been through over the past year. So, final sentence, it's perfectly understandable given the huge uncertainty and unpredictability of the security environment in the East. The EU's quest for certainty and clarity is, understandable. But, we would argue it may well prove to be a road to destructive certainty. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Michal, for this very stimulating, statement, and we will probably come back on this question of ambiguities, and could we still live with ambiguities when we are considering the neighbourhood of the EU. The problem is that ambiguities reflect the difficulty to arbitrate between several models. So does it mean that we have to arbitrate, and do we have to choose a model now or not? This is a question we keep for the discussion. So we have half an hour, which is very comfortable for questions and debates. What I would like to ask you is maybe to introduce yourself when you ask a question, and if the question is asked to a specific member of the panel, do not hesitate to say that. If not, we're going to give the possibility to all the members of the panel to answer your question. So, floor is open. Who is first? Always difficult to be the first. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I first wanted to congratulate the chair of the panel, because he belongs to the very few French who are able to pronounce Lucia Najšlová's name correctly. This is a rare feast, I have to say.
Well, I used to live in Prague for 3 years, so
okay,
that's some exercise.
That helps. Congratulations on that. But to a more sinister topic, and that is the European neighbourhood policy. I had to say, I'll have 3 very brief comments for all the panelists. I have to say that I'm even more skeptical than the presentations here, because for me the stress on differentiation is basically something that hides a euphemism, that hides a downgrading a general downgrading of the policy. If you look at the 3 areas which Jacques Rupnik mentioned, in which the part countries are interested, and that is money markets and mobility, or probably it would be mobility in the first place, market and money, then you don't see any increase in any of these areas in the recent time. If you look at the Riga summit, there even the implementation of the already signed DCFTA is conditioned, or there is a condition that there has to be the trilateral, I underline that, consultations, including Russia, on what the declaration calls provisional implementation. So it's not implementation anymore, it's provisional implementation of the DCFTA. So even those things we thought have already been reached and finished because it's been signed by both parties. No, these are reopened, and everything, all these 3 areas are cast into doubt. And I think that, as Jacques rightly put, this tells a lot, and that's my second comment, tells a lot not about the policy or the neighbourhood, it tells a lot about ourselves and our unwillingness to, and I think it brings together, and there I think is an overlap with the discussion about migration, about our increasing unwillingness to offer something to our neighbours, or to share something with our neighbours. And I'd like to remind you of the opinion poll that was published just yesterday. I think many of you are familiar with it, asking in 8 NATO member countries whether they would be willing to send soldiers in the case of a direct attack of somebody in the east on the eastern NATO members. So we are not talking about Ukraine, we are talking about the Baltic countries. And there were Canada, the United States, and the six EU European NATO members. And in none of the European NATO members there was a majority in favor of defending the territory of the alliance itself. So we are not talking about, expeditionary forces in Georgia or in Ukraine. We are talking about Poland. And paradoxically, even in Poland itself, it was not the majority of people, it's 47% only. So it really shows something about the deep transformation of how we perceive ourselves and what we are willing, or rather unwilling, to do. And my final comment related to what Lucia was talking about, and that is I have the impression that the less the population of a country knows about the EU, the more supportive it is of EU membership, and I think Ukraine is a nice example of that. I'm very much pro-European, don't misunderstand me, but it seems to me there is a kind of negative correlation there. And one of the things I'm really worried about is the social impact of the DCFTA. I mean, there has been a study carried out by the Commission, feasibility study about the DCFTA, the free trade area with Ukraine, part of the association, but it doesn't say almost anything about the social impact of the DCFTA. Of course, it acknowledges that there will be, especially in the short term, many losers of the integration process, but of course, given the current almost bankruptcy of the Ukrainian economy and the implementation of the provisional implementation of the DCFTA, this is a very risky business for myself, because the support for the EU is high, but it's very unstable, very volatile, and we risk a lot by ignoring the potential socio-economic impact on the already very impoverished populations in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petr. So I suggest that we take a couple of questions, and next on my list is Vladimir Handel.
Thank you, Christian. Not being an expert on the Eastern Partnership, I just have two questions. One is directed to our French colleagues, because we have with you here one half of the French-German couple. And it would be nice to get from your perspective, your assessment of how much the French-German cooperation on Eastern Partnership, on relations with Russia is really important. How far are you with coordinating the next steps? Because this is, Germany is never going to give up on Russia, but Russia has turned into a very difficult partner for Germany itself. So there's a great deal of concern, there's a great deal of urgency on the German side, and I would like to hear whether you see this German-French coordination really working well, and offering some kind of leadership in the European Union as well. So the Eastern Partnership with a strong leadership, of course, will never really work. So is German-French tandem going to offer a leadership in this case as well? And the second point, bring Russia back into the story. We know that Russian reaction to Eastern Partnership was very negative. At best, Eastern Partnership is perceived as a failure, but mostly the Eastern Partnership has been described as a declaration of Cold War on Russia and as a reason for the Ukraine crisis as a whole. So the Institute now, and Ben Tillis published now in the German Perspective, even more forecast, the Institute of International Relations in Moscow forecast for 2015, and it's an interesting read. And one of the issues there discussed is the only sort of element of possible hope or possible constructive dealing with the Eastern Partnership is opening up the Eastern Partnership to some kind of cooperative efforts, also with the Eastern, European, Euro-Asia Union, making the member states of Eastern Partnership compatible with norms and procedures of both European Union and European Euro-Asia Union of Russia. So this kind of opening up the member countries of Eastern Partnership to both influences, both normative and political influences. Is this any sort of issue which has been discussed in the German-French partnership? Because on the German side, there are indications that this opening up on a cooperative effort is undergoing and is being discussed and thought about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. Next is Jacques.
I have maybe more comments than questions to especially what Lucia and what Jacques Rupnik said. The first comment concerns Lucia's statement that we can only, if I understood correctly, we can only promote European values and political standards as much as we put our own house in order, meaning that we have problems with democracy, democratic standards within the EU, especially in Central Europe these days, so that constrains us in trying to promote democracy in the neighborhood, if that's what you said. And I think that there is to some extent I agree with this, but I think that there are two important caveats to that statement. One is that the argument that we cannot insist on certain human rights standards outside of Europe as long as Europe is not perfect is a very tricky one, because in this sense we couldn't protest against jailing of Azeri human rights activists because we have, our own justice system is not perfect. And the second, I think, more important aspect that needs to be mentioned is that part of this Russian insurgency, let's say, or new Russian foreign policy is also an attempt to support anti-democratic movements within the EU, and that should be seen as I think, the crucial factor of this new political landscape which we are facing. And so this is no longer that EU is trying to promote, let's call it, European values in the neighborhood, broadly understood neighborhood, including Russia, but Russia is actively trying to promote what it sees as its own values in the neighborhood and as well as in Europe. And there's this connection between populist, Eurosceptic parties and movements within the EU and Russian policy has been quite well described, and I think we need to keep it as part of the conversation, and as we try to analyze the mutual relations and neighborhood policy. So this is my first comment. The second comment goes to what Jacques Rupnik said about the differentiation and the successive stages of the differentiations within the neighborhood policy. And here I think also one should mention a couple of other things. I mean, the first differentiation that you said between East and South, I think that what I want to say is that each of these differentiations has a different character, so they don't form necessarily a kind of logical progress, as might be assumed after what you said. That is, the East and South differentiation, which I actually support, was based on the recognition of the fact that Eastern neighbors are European countries, which are neighbors of the EU, and southern neighbors are non-European countries, which are neighbors of Europe. And that's why some people were insisting that this should be somehow recognized in EU policies, and I think that was correct. The second differentiation between Russia and the rest of Eastern Partnership countries was basically response to Russia's unwillingness to be seen as just a neighbor of Europe, of the EU, but as an equal partner. And there was so we developed a separate policy vis-à-vis Russia in response to this concern. But what I think needs to be stated very clearly at this stage, that Russia at some point has changed its attitude towards neighborhood policy and moved from insisting that it should be treated separately to seeing neighborhood policy as a direct challenge to its own interests. And when Michal Šimečka rightly said that from Russian perspective, this is neighborhood policy is seen as a power grab by Europe to in the area which rightly belongs to Russia, or which is a kind of special area from Russian point of view. So I think that if we talk about new neighborhood policy, the crucial thing is to recognize that Russia has moved from a partner or potential partner to active competitor or adversary of our policy, and it has chosen to actively oppose and punish the countries, which, especially Ukraine, which decided to choose the European direction and punish them first with trade sanctions, which we still saw under Yanukovych, and then with military aggression. I think that when we analyze, we should put this very clearly. So it's not just that this kind of vague statement that somehow some of the neighborhood countries decided that neighborhood policy is not good for them. It's, I think, at least should be supplemented by recognition that there is an active opposing force to our neighborhood policy.
I'm sorry, Jacques, may I ask you to conclude?
Okay,
thank you. Last speaker before we go back to the panel is Marie-Maldras.
Thank you, Christian. Marie-Maldras, CERI-Sciences. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentations, and in a way, follow-up on what Jacques
you have to speak in the
follow-up
yes.
on what was just said. I think this is a very good point that now for Putin and the Kremlin, the neighborhood policy is seen as a threat and an aggression, and not as a sort of a benign project on the side of a very weak European Union. And this is, I believe, creating the differentiation and divisions amongst EU member states. So my question to our Czech colleagues is, we know rather well the positions of Poland and the Baltic states. We don't understand very well the positions of the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania. My provocative question is, do you see a new sort of axis, a new kind of positioning among those states? So that is, Jacques is right, there is no one East in the EU. Are there, is there a new family of state that may come to some kind of informal policy towards Russia, and I would say more importantly towards Ukraine, that is being maybe a little less supportive of Ukraine, precisely because Putin is now presenting the neighborhood policy as a threat and a challenge, thereby putting your governments in let's say, Central Europe in a position of, having to take clear attitudes. So I think we'd be very, very grateful if you could go a little more into that issue of your policies and your neighbors' policies towards Russia.
Thank you very much, Marie. The title of the next panel is EU Domestic Determinants of the Russia-Ukraine Policy, and I know that Petr will go into details on the question of the Czech position vis-à-vis the crisis. So you will have answers, I'm sure, to your question, Marie. So I'm going back now to the panel, and I'm starting with Lucia.
Thank you. So much has been said that I don't know where to start because I have a long list of notes, but I will limit myself to short.
You don't have to answer all.
I know, but I have to start with Jacques because obviously, we've been having this debate for years, so let's just continue. Obviously, I'm not saying that if not everything is 100% in the EU, 100% defined in the EU, we can't, say that we object, arrest in Azerbaijan. Of course, we can. But the point is, I think it is very convenient for us to say that all this was caused by Russia, and we are the best ones, and we are basically innocent. And I hope you are not saying that. So, just to bring more nuance to the discussion. Yes, for years, and Russian Federation has not kept it a secret that it is scared of what it calls a bloc approach to politics, and of course it prefers to deal with the states individually. And of course, it didn't like the Eastern Partnership. This is not a secret, it has been documented, etc. But this is one part of the discussion. Another part is, and we have to face it, what is it that we are offering the Eastern neighbors or Southern neighbors? And now I want to go beyond the usual and already boring, is it full membership or just partnership? But what are we offering in terms of politics and socioeconomic standards? I'm very happy that Petra brought up the discussion about DCFTA in the context of wider debate about selfishness, because this is what we are seeing in our politics to the east and to the south. Unwillingness to share. There are a number of public opinion polls that show you that, of course, the Czechs somehow are more fans of Ukrainians in this game. But if you ask the Czechs, so are you willing to, do you think that the Czech Republic should be part of the solution? Of course, you are going to get much less. This is also the case for the Poles. Now, speaking about selfishness, the problem is also the national framing, and we also see, and the recent crisis has showed it, that the Central Europe's prioritization of the East in foreign policy has to a large extent been a PR exercise. This has been a way how we were getting our leverage in the EU, saying, here we are useful, we have this so-called transition or transformation experience. But in fact, if you look at how much we neglected in practical politics, how little we have from our own experience brought into shaping the policy instruments, that is embarrassing. To give one more example from the discourse, there have been many concerns about what the Slovak government has been doing in relation to Ukraine. Also, let me highlight a gap between rhetoric and practice. The practice has been more optimistic. But then a major opposition party organizes a press conference last summer at the borders with Ukraine, not saying, guys, we have to think about Ukrainians as our friends, colleagues, humans. No, the main message is, we are the border, masses of refugees can come, and Ukraine is a threat. This is the problem. We have not learned anything yet from the securitization in the southern policy. Yeah? I mean, there is so much, the migration debate and the eastern debate have so much in common. Unfortunately, and also it is a consequence of the underinvestment into crucial institutions for democracy, also in this country, also in the neighboring countries. That we are not having a sufficiently sophisticated debate on this, and the debate often gets hijacked by just tabloid statements. There is one more short note on the DCFTA and the national sovereignty. I think this national sovereignty framing that it's up to the Ukrainians or the Macedonians or whoever else is willing to sign an agreement with the EU, that it's up for them to decide whether the trade agreements are good because they are sovereign nations. I think this is very convenient. And I think that we are washing away our responsibility because, and here I will refer to what Jacques Rupnik mentioned, the divide between North and South in the European Union. I mean, look at the youth unemployment numbers. Yeah, in Germany versus in Spain or Greece or Portuguese, I mean, Portugal, nobody can seriously say that the Southerners are lazy. That's why they do not work. Yeah, I mean, I don't believe that such debate should belong to a conference room like this. So obviously, there are some problems with systemic settings of the common market, and also with the way how some rules that are driving the common market, with the way how these rules are enforced. And when I'm saying that until we put our house in order, our offer is limited, this is what I mean. Yes, of course, we are very free to issue statements decrying the arrests and human rights violations in the neighborhood. But until we are going to really rethink and redo some of the settings of our internal market, our offer is really limited. I'll stop here, I think.
Thank you. Michal?
No, just very briefly on the comments on Russia's perspective on the Eastern Partnership. I think the interesting thing the interesting part is how it evolved from first Russia felt offended because it was included in the wider Europe concept. Then, as you rightly mentioned, it was kind of benign neglect of the Eastern Partnership because it was seen as something irrelevant politically, geopolitically. So Russians were much more focused on NATO expansion, the Bucharest summit, all that. The interesting thing is it was not until winter 2013, according to the various conversations with people who have been present, that the Russian government has actually woken up to the fact that this might be a strategic problem for them, and communicated this to the Europeans. It was really not until that very late stage that they have suddenly realized that, well, we don't like the Eastern Partnership, we really don't like it. So it's very late in that realization. And the problem was that on the part of the EU as well, which mismanaged the process in that it imposed this kind of either-or choice on the Ukrainian, Moldova, and Georgians, and that the notion that there is the incompatibility of the customs union and the European integration, the DCFTA, I mean, could have been avoided. I'm sure that there was a legal way out, but by the way that the EU framed this, it kind of upped the geopolitical stakes and made it easy for Russia, also by setting the date for the final showdown, which was the Vilnius summit. It was clear months ahead that at the Vilnius summit will be the crucial decision whether Ukraine is won or lost. And this framing of it actually helped the Russians to target Ukraine by trade coercion, by pressure, by everything, and then blackmailing Yanukovych in the months leading up to the summit. So the EU also sort of mismanaged the situation as well. And one other comment to the positioning of the Central Eastern European countries. Well, I'm from Slovakia, I think, as Lucia. The only remark I would have about the Slovak government from Czechoslovakia. I'm actually from Czech parents, yeah, my Czech and Slovak. And
the reunification is done.
I think the one thing I would say is that when people are trying to categorize the V4 or Central Eastern Europe as those being kind of principled and bold, like the Poles and the Baltic states, and then those being pro-Russian, I don't think this is the right characterization, because Slovakia is never going to be pro-Russian, but it's never going to be that Atlanticist, anti-Russian, pro-Eastern Partnership country as Poland or Baltic states. There was a period in time where that was the case under the government of Michal in the early 2000s. But that was a very specific period of time. There was a full NATO EU accession. That was when that line of foreign policy thinking was very dominant politically inside the country. Today, that's not the case. It's much more dispersed, and therefore Slovakia's foreign policy is much more pluralist. There isn't one single either pro-Russian or Atlanticist group of politicians, bureaucrats, diplomats who would be able to impose their views. So going forward, Slovakia will oscillate between these various positions and will mostly remain centered, because that period is not going to return. Thank you.
Thank you, Michal. Jacques?
Yes. Well, there are a number of comments. I can't do justice to all of them. I will just pick a couple. Perhaps I'll start with this interesting opinion poll, which I haven't seen, but which Petr Krakochvíl mentioned about NATO, and it introduces us to the subject of the perception of these crises in our public opinion. And in democracies, you have to take that on board. It is kind of disturbing to see those figures. It brings back to me the opinion poll that was conducted by, I think it was Pew, I think it was Pew, it was published in Financial Times in September 2008 after the Georgian crisis. And they asked NATO members, are you prepared, for Baltic countries? They didn't ask for, they specifically asked, not for Georgia or Ukraine, they asked for Baltic countries. Interestingly, all of them except two, you had strong majorities against doing anything, and the only two at that time that were for doing something were Britain and France, which was interesting. I mean, the two countries associated in this country with Munich, interestingly, perhaps because of that, had a different take. So this is something to bear in mind. The whole question about Article 5 guarantees, what it means. Obama went to Tallinn. I think his speech there was very important from this point of view. But yes, this is the situation we have, and the idea that you would put into kind of trade-off, Donbass versus Kansas, so that kind of thinking. So we are back into really the Cold War, you know, mutual assured destruction kind of thinking that we thought was really another age. And that brings me to the to the differentiation question, which several of you have raised. Of course, when I say differentiation, I didn't dwell on the fact that the main factor behind the differentiation was Russia, of course, in the recent differentiation. That was self-evident. I started by saying Europe has changed, Russia has changed, and I re-emphasized, and neighborhood has changed. And of course, the change in Russia was decisive. And if we're discussing really in a nutshell, the ENP has not changed. The neighborhood policy has not changed. The toolbox was there. There was sort of tinkering with it, and the concept was more or less on track. What has changed is Russia. Russia used to make, 15 years ago, Russia made distinctions between NATO and EU. After Orange Revolution, gradually, Russia stopped making that distinction and started seeing the two institutions as equally threatening. So there you have a major ingredient. But, of course, what does it tell you about the future of ENP? What you read everywhere is, well, the criticism of the Commission is, oh, you didn't sufficiently take into account the Russian factor in designing ENP. That is what you hear now. And you should therefore bear that in mind for future consideration. You cannot conceive a neighborhood policy which is in confrontation with Russia. Well, what is left then for your neighborhood policy is of course the big question. I would say, well, we will have this afternoon the discussion on Russia, so I don't want to preempt that because I think this is very important, and Marie knows about it more than I do. But what is perhaps the question concerning ENP, and I see the recent discussion around that, is all right, the old concept has not worked. Russia has produced an alternative concept of regional integration with this Eurasian Economic Union. And what you have, for instance, this is the latest piece in Foreign Affairs by Ivan Krastev and Mark Leonard. They suggest that, well, perhaps since our policy has not worked, you know, is there a way that these two things could not be just confrontational, but they could overlap? Can we imagine a formula? And I'm not saying that I have the formula, but they are asking the question, and this will be the question for our political leaders in the future, about the possible overlap of membership. That is, for instance, for a country, say Armenia, which could become a member, so you would not join the deep free trade agreement, but you could still be associated with a European association agreement. And anyway, you have this menu à la carte that will become, and the idea of dual or overlapping membership. Final word about, and that will be a transition to our next session. I forgot, I think you had asked about, our colleague Handel has asked about the Franco-German role there. Well, as you know, the Franco-German couple has undergone a major transformation in the last decade. It's a kind of lopsided couple these days, but it is interesting that in the Ukrainian crisis, it has worked in ways. It has fitted at every stage, you know, both in the Weimar format that I mentioned, then moving to the Normandy format, and Minsk 1, Minsk 2. Recently I heard Fabius with Steinmeier both saying that they, you know, consult everything very closely, that they see each other all the time. Steinmeier I think Fabius had this joke saying, well, yeah, I'm constantly with him, you know, so he says to his wife when he's not with her, he must be with me. So
any other days and nights.
And the French president speaks to Angela Merkel every other day, on average. This is a German ambassador in Paris. So this is a very, very close cooperation. It is all the more important for two reasons. First, because the United States has kind of outsourced its Ukraine-Russia policy to Europeans, which de facto in this case means the Franco-German couple. And it also is important because the two countries act as brokers within the EU. Imagine if it was just Germany. Would it work? I'm not so sure. You need the two. You need the East and South. You need the balance there. And that's being brokers within the EU for that kind of negotiation. Will it work at the end of the day? As I said, I ended with the question, what happens if Minsk II fails? You know, to be continued this afternoon. That will be, of course, a big question, and I'm sure that Putin has his own idea about that.
Thank you very much. It's now, yes, 11:35, and I think we have to stop this panel because we have now some other kind of food which is waiting. But before we do that, I would like to ask you to join me for thanking very much the three panelists for their presentations. So thank you very much. And thank you for your questions and comments. Maybe, Petr, you would like to say something about a very concrete point of organization?
Yes, very simple. We have a very early buffet lunch, which is waiting for you just outside and to the right, and you are all invited. Thank you.